Hi, друзья, привет! И мне с вами хочется поговорить на эту тему. How to learn irregular and phrasal verbs. Really, how to learn irregular and phrasal verbs. Как учить неправильные и фразовые глаголы. На самом деле, почему мне эта идея пришла в голову? Дело в том, что я совсем недавно, сегодня рано утром, я записывал видеокурс аж до 8 утра, потому что курс был объемный, выложил как раз видеокурс по неправильным глаголам на канале English Galaxy. Ссылку вы можете увидеть в описании к видео. И действительно, я постарался сделать очень качественный курс, как всегда, все бесплатно. И на самом деле вот у меня как раз возникла мысль поговорить на эту тему. Как учить неправильные глаголы, какие есть преимущества, недостатки и так далее. Различных методов, способов. Давай с вами эту на тему просуждаем. Let's talk about it. Why not? Почему нет? И, как всегда, поговорим на английском. Окей. Do you think, вы думаете, do you think it's important, do you think it's important to learn irregular verbs, to learn irregular, to know, I think not to learn это учить, to know irregular and phrasal verbs. Неправильные и фразовые глаголы. To learn irregular and phrasal verbs. Very well. Very well. Do you think it's important to know irregular and phrasal verbs very well? I think. Я думаю. I think you agree. Вы согласны. I think you agree that first of all, что прежде всего, I think you agree that first of all, прежде всего, first of all, we need to know, нам нужно знать. Right, I think you agree that first of all, we need to know, что нам нужно знать. We need to know. I think you agree that first of all, we need to know irregular verbs. Неправильные глаголы. Irregular verbs. To be more exact. Такая вот фраза, быть более точным. To be more exact. I think, я думаю, we need to know. Нам нужно знать. We need to know. We need to know most common irregular verbs. Нам нужно знать самые популярные, прежде всего, глаголы, неправильный глагол. I think we need to know most common irregular verbs first. Alright, next. And as for me, что касается меня, as for me, I made up. Я составил, I made up a list. I made up a list of 100. I made up a list of 100 irregular verbs. 100 неправильных глаголов не просто, но по популярности. By popularity. By popularity. By popularity. Let me tell you. Позвольте вам мне сказать, что я имею в виду. Let me tell you what I think. Все это выложено на канале English Galaxy, как я сказал, ссылка внизу. Можете с этим ознакомиться. Ну, давайте продолжать. Let's go on. Let me tell you what I think. Many people study irregular verbs. Many people study irregular verbs in the alphabetical order. Значит, alphabetical. Давайте с вами напишем, попытаемся написать это очень сложное слово, но на самом деле alphabet. Alphabetical. Алфавитный, alphabetical. Right. Many people study irregular verbs in the alphabetical order. I think, я думаю, it's a bit boring. Это немножко скучно. I think it's a bit boring. Потому что, we can study, мы можем изучать, we can study irregular verbs which are used, которые используются, which are used very rarely, которые используются очень редко, which are used very rarely, практически никогда, almost never, практически никогда. It's really, это действительно очень скучно. It's really very boring. It's really very boring and monotonous. Значит, есть такое слово монотонный и также monotonous. It's really very boring and monotonous. Sometimes, иногда это бессмысленно. Sometimes it's useless. Sometimes it's useless. I believe, я верю, я считаю. I believe we need, нам нужно. I believe we need to start, что нам нужно начинать изучать неправильные глаголы. I believe we need to start learning irregular verbs. We need to start learning irregular verbs with the most, начиная с самых популярных, самых распространенных. I believe we need to start learning irregular verbs with the most common ones. You like it. Вам это понравится. You like it because, потому что это будет легко. Because it will be easy. Это не будет вызывать у вас отвращение. Вызывать отвращение – это фразовый глагол put off. It won't put you off. Это не будет вас отталкивать. It won't put you off. You'll be full. Вы будете полны энтузиазма. You'll be full of enthusiasm. You'll be full of enthusiasm. Right, you'll be full of enthusiasm. That's one thing. Это первая вещь. Это вот that's или the first thing. Это первая вещь. That's the first thing. I also know. Я также знаю. I also know that many students. Что многие студенты. I also know that many students study irregular verbs. Изучают неправильные глаголы with the help, с помощью. I know that many students study irregular verbs with the help of cards. С помощью карточек, with the help of cards. I know this method. Я знаю. I know this method exists. Я знаю, что этот метод существует. I know this method exists. But there are, есть некоторые недостатки данного метода. But there are some disadvantages. Of this method. First, во-первых, you can't hear it. Вы не можете это слышать. First, you can't hear it. You don't know. Вы не знаете. You don't know how to pronounce. Вы не знаете, как произносить. You don't know how to pronounce these irregular verbs. Эти неправильные глаголы. You don't know how to pronounce these irregular verbs or sentences. Или предложения or sentences with these verbs correctly. Правильно. Вы не знаете, как это произносить правильно. There is often. Часто есть еще одна проблема. There is often one more problem. There is often one more problem, который заслуживает нашего внимания, which is worth of our attention. There is often one more problem, which is worth of our attention. It's very important. It's very important from my point of view. С моей точки зрения. It's very important from my point of view to see simple examples. Видеть простые примеры. To see simple examples. Видеть простые примеры. Imagine. Представьте. Imagine that your English level is low, что ваш уровень английского низкий, and you see very difficult examples, и вы видите очень сложные примеры, and you see very difficult examples. Of course, конечно. Of course, it isn't acceptable. Это недопустимо. Of course, it isn't acceptable. Acceptable. Of course, it isn't acceptable. So, таким образом, я пришел к выводу. So, I came up. Можно сказать, у меня появилась идея, я пришел к выводу. I came to the conclusion. So, I came to the conclusion that we need, что нам нужно следующее, that we need the following. So, it's a list, это список of these things, это список данных вещей. Далее, list of irregular verbs by popularity, по популярности. List of irregular verbs by popularity. Second, pronunciation. We need to see. Нам нужно видеть. We need to see and hear. И слышать the correct. We need to see and hear the correct pronunciation. I mean, я имею в виду, the correct pronunciation. Of the sentences, предложений. Of the sentences as well, также. Of the sentences as well. It's often a big problem. Это часто большая проблема. It's often a big problem. Then, the next very important point. Examples, примеры. Examples should be, должны быть простые. Examples should be simple, ясные, clear, and common. И распространенными. Examples should be simple, clear, and common. Very important things. Очень важные вещи. But that's not all. Это еще не все. You should, вам следует, or if you see a speaker, если вы видите того человека, который говорит, if you see a speaker, it can have, это может, it can have a very good, это может иметь очень хороший эффект, it can have a very good effect on the learning process, на процесс обучения, on the learning process. It's real communication, это живое общение, it's real communication. It's real communication. There is one more. Есть еще одно преимущество видеоуроков на YouTube. There is one more advantage. Of video lessons on YouTube. Ну, в частности, на моем канале. There is one more advantage of video lessons on YouTube. There are comments. Есть комментарии. There are comments. Есть комментарии. And you can ask any questions. И вы можете спросить любые вопросы. You can ask any questions. I'll answer them. Я отвечу на них. I'll answer them with great pleasure. It's possible now. Сейчас это возможно. Комментариев не так уж и много, не тысячи. It's possible. Это возможно. Это вполне возможно. It's quite possible. It's quite possible. И последнее, но не самое маловажное, как говорится, last but not least. Last but not least. Последнее, это очень хорошая такая фраза. Last but not least. Everything is free. Халява, да? Everything is free. Все бесплатно. You don't need to pay. You don't need to pay. You don't need to pay. Вы не тратите деньги. You don't need to pay. And you don't... И вы не тратите время на дорогу. And you don't spend time. And you don't spend time on the way. На дорогу. On the way. Там в какое-то место. To a certain place. Какое-то определенное место. On the way to a certain place. On the way to the certain place and back. Okay, I think that's enough. Я думаю, это достаточно. Касательно неправильных глаголов, that's enough. That's enough about phrasal. That's enough about, oh, not phrasal, irregular. Я же думаю о следующем. That's enough about irregular verbs. So, if you know 100, если вы знаете 100 irregular verbs, if you know 100 irregular verbs, and you can use, если вы, and you can use them, and you can use them, вы можете использовать их там in communication, в общении, in communication, that's great, that's great. Just do it, просто делайте это без ошибок. Just do it without mistakes. Just do it without mistakes. Let's look at phrasal verbs. Let's look at phrasal verbs. Давайте с вами посмотрим на фразовые глаголы. Let's look at phrasal verbs. I tend to think, я склонен думать. I tend to think that it's more difficult to learn them, but it's also possible, что их посложнее заучить, но это также возможно, but it's also possible, so you can watch my video courses, можете посмотреть мои видеокурсы, you can watch my video courses. Я постарался сделать их очень информативными. I tried to make them very informative. You might think, вы, возможно, подумаете, very informative. You might think, возможно, подумаете, that you don't need, что вам не нужны, that you don't need phrasal verbs, что вам не нужны фразовые глаголы. You might need that you don't need phrasal verbs. But native speakers, но носители языка, but native speakers use them. Носители языка используют их, but native speakers use them very often. So, таким образом, if I want to understand, если я хочу понимать носители языка, if I want to understand native speakers without any problems, без каких-то либо проблем, if I want to understand native speakers without any problems, or to speak, или говорить как носитель языка, or to speak like a native speaker, or to speak like a native speaker, I need to know, мне нужно знать, I need to know phrasal verbs. Мне нужно знать фразовый глагол. I need to know phrasal verbs. I made a list. I made up a list. Я составил список. I made up a list of 200 most common phrasal verbs. I made up a list of 200 most common phrasal verbs. Thank you very much. Спасибо вам огромное за вашу поддержку. Thank you very much for your support, за вашу поддержку. For your support. To be honest, честно, to be honest, I didn't expect, я не ожидал. I didn't expect 100 likes. Я не ожидал 100 лайков за 3 дня in 3 days. Okay, to be honest, I didn't expect 100 likes in 3 days, and I'm really happy. Я действительно счастлив. I'm really happy that these videos, что эти видео about phrasal verbs, о фразовых глаголах, это не просто видео, это видеокурсы. These video courses about phrasal verbs and irregular verbs становятся все более популярными, are getting more and more popular. I'm sure. Я уверен. I'm sure. It's our mutual. Это наша совместная победа. It's our mutual victory. I'm sure it's our mutual victory. I'd like to ask you. Я хотел бы спросить вас. I'd like to ask you. So ask you too. How do you? Как вы изучаете? How do you study? How do you study irregular? How do you study irregular and phrasal verbs? Как вы изучаете неправильные или фразовые глаголы, irregular or phrasal verbs? If you have already, если вы уже все это изучили, if you have already studied all this, if you have already studied all this, you could share, вы могли бы поделиться, you could share your secrets with us. That would be great. Это было бы прекрасно. That would be great. Действительно, это было бы прекрасно. Окей, давайте с вами все проверим и повторим. Итак, наши две цели. Первая — это все повторить, закрепить. И второй, если есть опечатки, то мы с вами по ходу уберем. Потому что, вы поймите, не так просто все спонтанно писать, без подготовки. Но окей, let's do it. How to learn irregular and phrasal verbs. Do you think it's important to know irregular and phrasal verbs very well? I think you agree that first of all we need to know irregular verbs. To be more exact, I think we need to know most common irregular verbs first. As for me, I made up a list of 100 irregular verbs by popularity. Let me tell you what I think. Many people study irregular verbs in the alphabetical order. В алфавитном порядке. In the alphabetical order. I think it's a bit boring. Because we can study irregular verbs which are used very rarely, almost never. It's really very boring and monotonous. Sometimes it's useless. I believe we need to start learning irregular verbs with the most common ones. You like it because it will be easier. It won't put you off. You'll be full of enthusiasm. That's the first thing. I also know that many students study irregular verbs with the help of cards. I know this method exists, but there are some disadvantages of this method. First, you can't hear it. You don't know how to pronounce these irregular verbs or sentences with these verbs correctly. There is often one more problem, which is worth of our attention. It's very important from my point of view to see simple examples. Imagine that your English level is low and you see very difficult examples. Of course, конечно, it isn't acceptable. So I came to the conclusion that we need the following. list of irregular verbs by popularity. Right, a list, or we can put an article, a list of irregular verbs by popularity. Next, pronunciation. We need to see and hear the correct pronunciation, the correct pronunciation of the sentences as well. It's often a big problem. 3. Example should be simple, clear, and common. If you see a speaker, it can have a very good effect on the learning process. It's real communication. Really, this communication is real. There is one more advantage of video lessons on YouTube. There are comments and you can ask any questions. I'll answer them with great pleasure. It's quite possible. Last but not least, everything is free. You don't need to pay and you don't spend time on the way to a certain place and back. Right, absolutely correct. That's enough about irregular verbs. If you know 100 irregular verbs and you can use them in communication, that's great. Just do it without mistakes. Let's look at phrasal verbs. I tend to think that it's more difficult, что более сложно, that it's more difficult to learn them. Изучать их, that it's more difficult to learn them, but it's also possible. You can watch my video courses. I tried to make them very informative. You might think that you don't need phrasal verbs, but native speakers use them very often. So if I want to understand native speakers, если я хочу понимать носитель, if I want to understand native speakers without any problems, or to speak like a native speaker, I need to know phrasal verbs. I made up a list of the 100 most common phrasal verbs. Thank you very much for your support. To be honest, I didn't expect 100 likes in 3 days. I'm really happy that these video courses about phrasal verbs and irregular verbs are getting more and more popular. I'm sure it's our mutual victory. Really, it's our mutual success. Это наш общий успех. I'd like to ask you too, how do you study irregular and phrasal verbs? If you have already studied all these, you could share your secrets with us. That would be great. Really, that would be great. That would be fantastic. Okay, thank you very much for watching. See you soon. Bye.